Anna Szymanska. I am a social media producer for Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. I'm here with a few of my colleagues. We are based. That's a great photo you guys picked. We have our headquarters in Prague, and we have bureaus in about 26 countries. And it's my pleasure to be talking today with these two gentlemen, the Vice President of the Atlantic Council, Damon Wilson, and then a fellow, Maxim Eristavi. So I guess we spent 2 very intense days, very busy days, learning a lot, talking a lot about how to counter propaganda. So what do we do to leave this conference and essentially not ever come back to something like that? Would you like to?
All right, first of all, what a great question to begin with. First of all, let me just say thank you. This is remarkable what's been happening in this room over the past 2 days, and I want to give hats off to the work that Max Czuperski, the whole Digital Forensics Research Lab, has done. I want to pay tribute to the work that Maxim has done and how he came into the Atlantic Council family through much of this process. This is really important, what's playing out here in this room, because part of what we're trying to help folks understand through the work of the Atlantic Council is that we don't sit back and wait and look to governments to answer some of these questions. We've got some real challenges, some real problems out there. And the solutions are going to come from many of you in this room today. There's an agency that we have to take hold of this. And I want to just juxtapose a little bit with sort of the story of the Atlantic Council, because it helps you understand how the world has changed and how this work's so important. The Atlantic Council grew out of the ashes of World War II. And it grew out by a group of people who were in the Truman and Eisenhower administration, were literally present and part of building the world that we live in today. They were there for the San Francisco negotiations for UN, Bretton Woods negotiations, NATO, all that. And when they left government, they were called together at the beginning of the Kennedy administration across party lines to say, look, the Soviet threat is very, very serious. We need you to knock it off, get over your partisanship, merge your organizations, because we need to help make the case for something permanent. We've got to be permanently constructively engaged in the world. And that we've got to set an ambitious agenda for that. We've got to maintain political support for that. And we've got to maintain public support for that. And that was really possible, this whole story, because the United States came out of World War II as 50% of the global economy. The world has changed dramatically right now. And we are going into a new world in which we don't know what the rules are going to be. We've seen through disinformation, through what you've been looking at here, that there's a lot of effort to tear that down. We can't sit back and wait for those that came out of the Truman and Eisenhower administration to fix it. It's going to be groups like this. It's going to be the work that you're doing in this room. It's going to be the agency of civil society, the power of organizations like this that begin to help us figure out what the building blocks and the rules of the road are going to be going forward. So I won't go on further in this right now. I want to play this out. But there is an incredible power and agency to this approach. It started a little bit when we were appropriately following this Ukraine 360 wounds. It started with the story of what's going on in Ukraine today. And so I think it's very appropriate that was the introduction. Jeff Pyatt, our ambassador at the time, we were doing a lot on Ukraine. And we said, how can we help? And he said, I need something that isn't stamped U.S. government, that isn't intelligence, that makes the case of what we all know, that Russian forces are in Ukraine, but that we're still having trouble actually with clarity of getting that out and accepting. And it was the power of this team putting it together and being able to tell that story through the eyes of Russian media, Russian soldiers' footprints, that actually helped begin to change some of that debate. And we have seen a groundswell shift in Washington in the debate on this particular issue. That's just emblematic of why I think all of this matters right now.
Maxim, and coming from your experience, what do you think our next steps should be?
Well, first of all, I'm extremely humbled to be in this room, seeing so many brilliant people trying to figure out how to fix this together. And I think that if we would actually, which is not a very usual thing for journalism, to work together and overcome your ego, but if we imagine that we work all together to fix this problem of disinformation, we actually can achieve great things together. Again, if we work together. And again, terrific thing that Atlantic Council does is something that they didn't have to actually do. They help us journalists do the job when it comes to disinformation. But it's, again, another example that sometimes probably just going through usual channels of fighting disinformation is not enough, and we have to bring as many allies as possible. But speaking from frontline experience, we've been dealing with disinformation for more than 3 years, and Ukraine and Eastern Europe is the first place where all these disinformation tactics that we're talking about were tested successfully, unfortunately. And Ukrainian journalists or journalists at Eastern Europe, they've been dealing with the same fact-checking, verifying information for years. So sometimes it's a very exhaustive process, and you are basically dealing with the onslaught of lies, organized lies. As a journalist, just a human being, sometimes it's very hard to lose track of what you do. So now we sometimes do too much of just countering organized lies or debunking myths. And sometimes we forget that actually the power of storytelling is what we're should be passionate about. And verifying, fact-checking is an important job, and it's part of our everyday activities. But we shouldn't forget that it's important for us as journalists. What we are doing here is for us as a community of journalists. But for our audience, they don't much care about verifying, fact-checking. They want powerful narrative. So in my experience, it's not very productive just to put out there the story that is just debunking something, unless it's a part of very powerful story that other people can actually pick up. So this is the first, my point, that you should lead with stories and not following Russian propaganda or any propaganda for that matter. And you should lead and engage your audience not through debunking myths, but through setting your own narrative and pushing for your own stories. The second important part is about independent journalism. Unfortunately, the region is struggling for resources. We have a bunch of really small independent newsrooms in the region that are trying to tell alternative stories, but sometimes it's not enough for them to break through the wall of propaganda or break through the wall of outside world not caring enough. So supporting independent journalism matters, and them providing stories that can be an alternative to those stories from propaganda also matters. Because propaganda, why it's so effective, because it's exciting, it's a good story, and people love it because it's fascinating, no matter if they agree with it or not. But there are so many other stories that tell much more exciting, much more important narratives in the region that are produced by independent journalists, whether it's Novaya Gazeta in Russia or Hromadske in Ukraine, but sometimes they struggle to take those stories to the outside world and inspire people and actually to show the region in a different light that propaganda tries to portray it. So amplifying voices of independent journalism is important. And the third, last thing, is about being passionate about what you do. Speaking from my experience working within a Russian state newsroom for almost 2 years and seeing how propaganda was actually developing and coming on the surface, I can tell you that these people, we usually treat them one-dimensionally. They're not just paid, robotic monkeys pushing that information and creating that propaganda wave. They're passionate about what they do. Yes, they do organized crime, and yes, they do evil stuff, but they're passionate about it. So sometimes I wonder why we, who are standing on the right side of history and doing what's right and telling the truth and pushing for facts, sometimes are not passionate about it. Why our stories are always just catching up with lies and not providing our own narrative that we feel passionate about. So do what is right, but also be passionate about. So take it to your newsrooms, take it to the stories that you care about. Don't think too much about Russian propaganda. Think about how you can actually provide a very good story that has nothing to do with propaganda or organized lies.
Well, we can be as passionate as we can about our work, but the question that always gets raised in conferences and places like this is, how do we get the product to the audience that we're trying to reach? And I was wondering, because it's something that you mentioned, that we don't have to wait for any help, but the help is there. For instance, the governments are trying to, Ukraine set up a Ministry of Information. Germany is now going to fine Facebook and Twitter for hate speech, for instance. The governments are getting involved. Is that a good thing? What do we do with this?
Well, let me come at it from a little bit of a different perspective. One, I just don't think we need to be dependent on what governments do. We're not going to sit back and wait and see what the Trump administration does on X, Y, and Z. We're going to be out there trying to shape the agenda. We're going to be setting the terms of the political debates, that some choices are not politically viable and some are. And we're going to affect the environment in which they operate. And that means we have to up our game. We have to figure out how to actually be more effective in this. And so the way I think about this, kind of the three principles that have come out of the work that I think really matters when I reverberate it back into the broader body of work of the Atlantic Council is the clarity, engagement, and how we handle the partisanship, and that's particularly relevant in the United States. Clarity is why this work is so important. If you can't get a political leader to stand up and say that Russia has invaded Ukraine, if you can't get a political leader up to say Russia has intervened in the American elections, if you can't get a political leader up there to say that those that are sitting on the other table at Minsk are thugs and terrorists, how are you going to come out with the right policy conclusions, much less long-term strategies? You're premising those decisions based on something that is actually very, very fake, very false. And I think it's the power of the work that comes out of here connected to the other types of work that we get involved in that holds people's feet to the fire. Russia invaded Ukraine. Now let's start and figure out what our policy options are. The people who are representing the leaders in Donetsk and Luhansk, these are not legitimate counterparts that sit across the table from other folks. These are killers and thugs. We have to keep this in mind. And if we can't call out Russia's intervention in our election, how the hell are we going to get policy right? This is really a key issue that I think this, sort of the work here, creates the environment in which governments have to then decide and operate, in which political leaders can or can't do things. And I think that's the power of the agency. The second one is that engagement piece, is that what is so powerful is that any of the work that comes out of each one of you that you're doing, it's amplified, as you've been talking about, because you've got an army of people doing this. You are engaged in it. People are passionate about it. And that's how we make this work catalytic. I think that's really important, and one that Max has been trying to get us to learn at the Atlantic Council, that the old school approach of think tanks, just putting out information, goodbye, we're done with that. How do you actually bring people along in that equation? And the final one, and it's particularly worrying to me as an American, and it's why this still matters, I think, a lot at a place like the Atlantic Council. I don't really see what we're fighting as being left versus right, as being Democrat versus Republican. We're bipartisan. We're nonpartisan. The struggle we are in right now is open versus closed in our societies. And we have got to define that and fight that. I mean, look at the French election. The left and right kind of fell apart, and we ended up with Macron and Le Pen. We sort of have trapped ourselves in a duopoly in the United States, the way the parties have enriched the system essentially to hold on to it. But the battle, and partly what I love about the Atlantic Council, is that we've got Republicans and Democrats every day sitting around the table who are internationalists, who are serious, who know what they're talking about, problem-solving ethos. We create that safe space. And we're in a common battle for a sense of openness, that there are some good things that can actually be anchors for our societies. And that's the fight we have to take forward. The challenge that we have right now is what you're talking about, disinformation, is being empowered by a degree of a partisan patina in the United States. I think it was Adam that said 46% of Republicans right now think Russia's a friend or ally. What the hell is that? Like, where is that coming from? It's because we have given it oxygen and license, because we haven't been able to speak with clarity that these guys are bad and have done things to intervene in our elections, and to break it away from the partisan politics, which is why we have to anchor it, I think, in credible work, credible analysis, independent research, and it's why we as an institution and all of you need to be pushing this agenda forward rather than it coming forward through political channels, because the moment it gets locked into that partisan patina, Putin is winning that approach. We've got to break that down. Sorry for going on too long on that.
No, that's quite all right.
I think that you actually then really highlight what this is all about, and what we've been here for the last 2 days is back to the concept of storytelling. One of the reasons why we think they've been succeeding so well is because all our institutions have been built in analog time. Everyone that is in this room was born at a time when things were still relatively analog. Information was absorbed one way. Everyone of you here in the room started learning in school with a piece of paper and a pen. And now every single one of you is having a tablet, an iPhone, and even Damon manages to use an iPhone. And what that actually is and what that reflects is a transition in our society that has never happened in the history of mankind. Think about it. No one in history of mankind ever again will go through a transition. Anyone who's born now, and I know Adam has a young son, he doesn't know what analog is. He plays with it, but he's completely used to playing with an iPad. And this transition was really fast, right? Went from stiff computers to mobile phones to access to information everywhere. So we've switched from information to engagement. The problem is that our institutions that we've created, democracy is pretty darn old, have not adopted to that. Why? Because democracy is slow. Because the arch of democracy bends very slowly and is very long and takes a long time. And this is sort of the vacuum that you were talking about, where ill-intended individuals and less benevolent forces, and it's not just Russia, but it's ISIS, it's populists on the far right and the far left, seize that moment because they don't play by the rules. And so, as much as institutions and democratic institutions, the government has to step up to it, the only people that can really, really step up to it, and this is why we are all here today and yesterday, is in our view civil society, it is journalists, it is people who are the first line of defense of the very values that we all stand for. So, how do we move together towards the digital resilience? Again, journalists are usually competing, but let's compete not to where the puck is, but where the puck is going to be. Joseph and Natalia gave one example. They didn't show a story the way we used to. They showed it where it's going to be, because I'll tell you what, just a few years from now, the bad guys are going to do the same thing. You're going to have MR, you're going to have AR, and you're going to have VR being misused and misinformed people. Let's start getting ready to where it's going to be. Christian, who actually passed out already by now, because he's been up for several days again, as you've noticed, he's also doing that together with Elliot and all others at Bellingcat. They're trying to think about where is the capability going to be tomorrow and not just today. So that's kind of what we really want to foster here, so that we actually create a degree of digital resilience. And then it's much harder for a bully to tweet the wrong things, tell the wrong things, and misinform people.
Now, Max, as a journalist, I was wondering, so what is the next step, essentially? We've seen the 360 videos today. We've seen these open source investigations. We've done an amazing job here, but what is the next thing? Should we be doing social media, focus only on that? Or should we do something what Coda does, for instance, and focus on a particular topic and just cover that? Is there a thing that we should, I don't know, look forward to or work on?
Where's the book going to be, I think, is
everything.
the question.
This is the most, for me personally, but probably for all of you, this is the most exciting, maybe frustrating, exciting time for journalists, because we can experiment with so much. You know, every day you figure out some other way to do a storytelling. But it's important to experiment at every newsroom. But what is important is I left this word amplifying, and we've heard that so many times. And amplifying is something that I came around in recent year, because obviously I was frustrated. I was angry as hell about Russian propaganda, but more importantly, I was angry that not only propaganda uses amplifying on a very organized, great way. Those people who should fight propaganda, they actually, retweet and reshare it, maybe to make fun, maybe to point interest to it, but at the same time amplifying it as well. When in fact stories that coming from region, from frontline stories like does Hromadske or Maidan TV, they're not being amplified. So I was angry about it. So what I did, I actually joined this project last year, Russian Language News Exchange, that what it does, it takes together newsrooms from, independent newsrooms from the region. It does simple stuff. Like if one newsroom publishes one story, it's being reshared at least 7 times by other newsrooms. Okay, it's not enough. Sometimes you don't have millions of views, but it's amplifying. This is the first start. And I think by doing amplifying and sharing stories sharing stories about truth, not resharing propaganda, not helping propaganda, is something we should all think about. And especially if you're a young or a small newsroom, you should help each other out. Because if you work on the front line, like Eastern Europe, for example, or other front lines, you're going to lose that battle if you're on your own. So build bridges and help each other That's the only way we can basically help each other out in here.
Is there a reason for us to actually counter propaganda, or do we just stick to essentially talking about facts and telling our stories, or do we have to come up with a counter propaganda?
So I think that we actually shouldn't counter. Governments do that, right? Especially governments. They'll be like, oh, we need to do a counter this, counter that, counter that. What you end up having is actually the thing that we've all seen during the Cold War, at least those who were born then, not me, is that you have one side pushing against the other one. Actually, we then drop back into the other thing, that behavior of the past, where red is saying this, blue is saying that, the public is squeezed in between, and whoever gets exposed more to it wins, right? I think that's a mistake, because we then do not up being better than the people who try to undermine the values on which our societies are built. Facts and verification is a completely different thing. It is something that if you really take it down to the most purest form, is convincing in itself. You don't need to push it. And if you look at what Bellingcat has been doing, if you look at what Hromadske has been doing, Fanpage in Italy and others in the room here, they often didn't put a spin on their story, but rather they wanted to bring the most purest version of the story to the audience. And that's why it's so successful. It's not successful because Christian and Rao, who is also here, and a few others, and Nareem, go online and say, we are right, we are right, we are right, we are right. Now what they say is, look at the facts and make your own opinion. And most everyone who has some sort of smarts will come to the conclusion, no, actually, I disagree with them, but the facts are right. In fact, there was a Russian soldier in Ukraine who took a selfie and checked in. Oh, CENTCOM did actually accidentally or intentionally strike a mosque. Oh, the Chinese did do this or that. And that's the thing where we have to move back to, is facts and talking about the facts.
There are very few of those people, though.
But I also think it's just prophylactic, preventive, the way this is operating. And I think you see it, I could be exaggerating, y'all know better than I do, but if you look at the French electorate, the German electorate, and compare the United States, it's the exposing and educating so that open societies are actually digitally resilient. They understand what's going on. And so the Macron leaks in France are about the leaks, are about the story of it leaking rather than what's in it itself. And you see a blip. People understand what's happening. So how do you expose, educate, and make our publics resilient to this type of disinformation and manipulation?
Can I add quickly about what should we actually do? And I think that one thing that is missing in the last 3 days, we didn't talk about the psychological effect that propaganda has, even on people and us who deal with it. Sometimes we feel like we're professional, we can tell things apart. But at the same time, propaganda is a very toxic thing. And I'm pretty sure I've met so many people in the last 3 years who are actually dealing with propaganda. Sometimes you're one way or another, you become affected by it as well. For example, you start believing that truth is a relative thing, right? Why, if people believe in lies, we should push for truth because nobody cares about it so much. So by avoiding that, and I'm not saying we should work on propaganda and expose it, but again, one more time, you have your own narrative and you care about stories you care about and not following propaganda. And that by doing so, this is not the first time we're dealing with propaganda in human history. We had so many instances before. And what happens? People get tired of propaganda. You cannot possibly convince them not to believe propaganda if they do. So it's not worth even trying. But they will eventually get tired of propaganda. But because propaganda is aggressive, negative, it's lies, and we as human beings, we respond to it in the long term is being tired and frustrated about
exhausted.
It. And when they do get tired, what they're going to do, they will reach out for truth and for journalism. And if you're not there with independent newsrooms, with high-quality journalism, if your content is not sexy enough and is lame and boring, they will reach out. They didn't find anything because you were busy countering Russian propaganda or any kind of propaganda. But the second is gone. You don't have anything a backlog to offer them as an alternative. So invest in this now and work on those stories that has nothing to do with propaganda now.
What An important point to add there also is that the investment that we do now has a very long-reaching and long-stretching impact. Kids now, I don't know, Adam, you might want to jump in on this one, and anyone who has kids now, they don't learn as much about how to be digital resilient in school as we would perhaps want them to be. They don't know that if they see a picture and they just click right and they can do a reverse Google search, that they suddenly discover that this is not an actual tank rolling into Russia from Ukraine, but it's an old picture of a Russian tank rolling into Georgia. There is not anymore a baseline sort of educational level when it comes to digital resilience because it has never existed. So whatever we do now is going to help to set up that base knowledge that we teach everyone. Think about it that way. We used to sneeze and cough into our hands, and eventually the medical field has discovered that's kind of bad because each time we sneeze and cough into our hands, we shake our hands, we spread the germs. Now everyone sneezes into their sleeve and you don't spread the diseases anymore. And that's kind of what we need here is don't just repost stuff, be critical and be digitally resilient. And that's really what we want to push here with all of you guys, even if some of you compete or not. Push digital resilience, set the bar so high that the guys who are trying to misinform us and saturate it with propaganda can't even get there. Be proactive.
Can we actually get there, though? Can we convince... Is there a point of talking to people who do not want to listen to us?
I think that the worst that you can do is not talk with someone. With someone, not to someone. Because, you know, we had a little bit of a focus on Russia and Eastern Europe here because we are in Poland. But what happens when no one talks with you and only talks to you, it sometimes alienates the person. And that's one of the things that has been happening in Germany, that has been happening in France. We have second, third generation immigrants from Europe South and the Middle East who, at the time of great transition in society, have not been listened to. And they become a perfect target then for extremist groups who actually do talk with them, right? You have an ISIS recruiter online who does start talking with you, and he listens to you, and he doesn't tell you, oh, you need to go and join ISIS. The first gateway to extremism is not someone telling you, oh, come and join ISIS, it's going to be awesome, free hot dogs and ice cream. By the way, you're not going to shave a beard for 2 weeks. What they do is they gradually talk with you. So we need actually to not stop talking, but talk with people to make sure they don't slide even farther away.
How do we do that?
Well, it is, I mean, I take it back to sort of the fundamental principles. I mean, the free media, all of this is sort of an anchor of an open democratic society. And what we're seeing is and we've gone through this in the United States, we're doing this with all of our own work at the Atlantic Council. If we don't involve chunks of the population in the conversation, if we aren't listening as much as we're speaking, how are you engaging? How are you actually bringing to life sort of that civic life that is the fundamental sort of beating heart of making democratic open societies work? And I think we got a little bit of a hubris going on. My family is from South Carolina. I've got family-in-law in rural Virginia. And they look at Washington and they're like, okay, over the past decade, you got us in 2 wars we're still fighting, a huge financial crisis that we're still paying for and that you seem pretty fine to having dealt with. And as far as we can tell, you can't get anything decided or agreed in Congress. Like, I'm going to throw a brick through the window because what's up? And so we've been thinking about, okay, at the Atlantic Council ourselves, we've been so focused on an international audience, so focused on an elite audience, on the foreign policy. We forgot the anchor that when we were founded, Bob Hope was our spokesman because we had 3 channels, public channels in the United States. Bob Hope was our spokesman on TV, bringing the American people with us on this idea that, hey guys, we're not coming home this time. We're making a permanent commitment to engagement in the world, which was a fundamental reversal of the DNA of the American people. And we had to engage the American people in understanding why that was in our self-interest. Why was it in our self-interest to do that? And so I think we have to remember our own foundations of democracy, but a lot of what we're talking about also translates. It's the radical, violent extremism. It's authoritarianism. It's kleptocracy. These are the corrosive forces that are fueling all this crap that we're having to cut through. So how do we equip, how do we prepare, how do we give agency to people to help determine their own future that chips away? And I think the reason they're on offense is is because they know that the work you're doing here is how you chip away at authoritarian kleptocracy on the one hand, violent extremism on the other. And that's what we have to remember. That goes away. Think about how different your jobs are. They might actually be a lot more boring, although we're always going to have problems. Look at ourselves. But think about what happens if there's an agency in which more people in the Middle East have a say in their future, a sense of destiny, control over what they're doing, a place to turn for dignity and justice, and how that's going to undermine the recruiting grounds of violent extremism. Think about in societies, whether it's Belarus or Russia, how it would be fundamentally different if it wasn't run as an authoritarian kleptocracy that manipulated this environment. These are the fundamentals that you're chipping away at or empowering others to help chip away at. And I think that's what anchors this and what's really strategically important. It drove me crazy when I worked at the White House and our folks would want to sort of focus on where they needed to put their priorities for collection and intelligence and this and that. And they always put sort of the democracy, the civil society thing always last. And I was like, wait a second, guys. If Belarus were a democracy today, items 1 through 22 on your list, WMD exports, all this other, these go away. These go away. And yet we get trapped in sort of a different dichotomy. And I think you're sort of the building blocks of actually helping to equip your colleagues, your friends, societies to actually go back to the core truth of how you give people a voice. And in doing so, we're going to fundamentally change the nature of these problems we're dealing with.
And one important thing here to add also is that just don't think about the West alone, because we're seeing a lot of disinformation because of how hyper-connected we are here. There's entire societies who have skipped the computer and went straight to the smartphone in the heartland of Africa. You have millions, in fact billions on the Asian continent being increasingly more and more connected. If you think that this battle against disinformation is tough now, wait 2, 3, 4, 5 years. We have, however, an extreme opportunity here to come together, create more digital Sherlocks, as we like to call them, and start setting a standard that will not only be replicated here, but be replicated elsewhere. We had people on the Maidan, when TVs were turned off, simply grabbed our smartphones and started turning them into a live broadcasting theme that ended up in Hromadske. We had folks in Hong Kong do the same. We had folks in other countries do the same, even Belarus. Think about where things will go when things are even more connected. Drones are flying over Mali, providing internet even at a time when Boko Haram and others are trying to turn it off. That will all come. And if we don't set the standard for it, if we don't set the bar high, someone else is going to do it on our behalf. And with that, I think we should probably open up to the audience to have a final conversation.
Just a quick comment on the one thing that's not mentioned about international stories. One thing why I'm building bridges between Eastern Europe to the rest of the world, not because I'm coming from the region, but because it's such a fascinating place. All things that are happening here that at some point happened there 3 years ago. When it comes to disinformation, fighting propaganda, we had Orban or other leaders in the region. Now you have similar leaders in Western world. Thing that happened in Poland just a couple of days ago with busing people to the protest. It happened in Ukraine 4 years ago. So by looking at those stories, they're not local anymore. They're also interconnected. And by catching up with those local stories, sometimes you can see your future or counter those trends in your own country that are coming, because eventually we're all dealing with the similar problems these days.
Well, I think it's only fair if we actually give everybody a chance to talk to us and ask a few questions. But unfortunately, Damon has to leave. I know you are in a tight schedule. Thank you so much for having us here. Actually, it was a great experience for all of us. And thank you so much for this conversation.
No, let me thank you, thank everybody here. Y'all are doing amazing work. It's really inspiring. And if we could get an ounce of the impact that comes out of the work you're doing into that room over there and get policymakers really sort of shaped and informed by what you're doing, we do have the ability to shape this future and not let that void be filled by people that don't share our values and interests. So thank you so much for everything you're doing in this room.
Thank you.
Good luck. Thank you.
Thank you. So we're going to use this now to really start turning this into a final conversation. You guys are welcome to stay on stage. And Graham, who's our deputy, is going to join me here. we want to use the next 15 to 20 minutes to talk about your ideas, what you want to do, how can we collaborate. We want to make sure that you guys don't just came here and had a great time, but let's make sure we get a tighter network. Let's find a way how we together can say our story stronger, spread it, build it, and inspire ourselves to really become the digital Sherlocks that set the standards, not just here, but around the world. So Elliot and Ben, who are in the room, are going to have Mike still help us as well. Raise your hands, be creative, be disruptive, be interruptive, and let's have a final conversation for 20 minutes, 15 minutes before we close. Please. And also say your name, just so we can better connect.
I'm Rosaria Talarico from Italy. I'm a journalist, an investigative journalist.
Hi, Graham.
I have one question before saying what to do in the future. What do you think? Maybe in Russia they are doing something similar? 360 OS Russia?
Well, I actually, and you guys might know this better, I think that they're equally trying to convince people of certain realities, but I think that they hate this type of stuff. Journalists coming together, organizing themselves, trying to figure out how to tell the truth. They're not doing what we are doing here. They're trying to go back to the old methods. Elliot and his team, they were investigating MH17. What it ended up with, and I think his brother's here too, Russ, what we ended up with is actually not them trying to do a parallel thing, but rather them going and trying to blackmail Elliot, send people to his family's houses, and so forth. I think that the methods they used for intimidation are actually very much looking backward and not forward.
And what about technologies? Because maybe this is what's happening right now, but maybe in the future they can change their mind, and we should be aware too.
They're definitely using technologies, and they've been misusing that. This is why we were trying to stress not about just where disinformation is today, but how to think about where the puck is going to be. So, an example. Mixed reality, augmented reality, and virtual reality. There's companies today that aren't really publicly that big yet. They're working on how to create a whale coming through this room and looking so incredibly authentic without actually really being there. It's more and more interconnected. We're going to see a degree of connection and virtual reality and mixed reality that will really affect us in the daily lives. I guarantee you that people who are ill-intended are trying to think how to use that to further manipulate us. I guarantee you that. Yeah.
I'm sorry. I actually, it's a great point, and I think that the reason, and I'm speaking from my personal experience working in one of those newsrooms before, and I saw how it started. So one of the reasons why it's so successful at technologies now, because they were underdogs, and they didn't have any access to regular channels to spread information. So they got very excited about using and be creative and experimental. So, for example, RT and their, before propaganda success with YouTube was one of the first successes for any media business in the world. Social media, then creating, using, for example, forums and so on, and being constantly creative, figuring out how to reach American audience or European audience without having any channels to do that, mainstream channels. So I think this is a terrific lesson to learn from them, because they were frustrated, they got creative, and they reached the audience not having, regular channels. And they're going to keep doing that. But we must catch up now and be more even creative.
And just one question more.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, Ben.
Okay.
You'll get the mic back. You'll get it back. Mike. I don't want to give it back.
Yeah, no. So just something else. Another way that they're using technology already is they've been mimicking open source techniques. And Elliot's done some great work on this, where you've seen the Russian foreign minister, the Russian Army or the Air Force do their airstrikes. People like Bellingcat come out and show you the satellite photos of this is where it actually happened. The Russian MOD caught on to this, so they started doing press briefings where they were showing satellite photos as well, except that they had photoshopped the photos. And so they knew that reality was not on their side, so they tried to use technology to fake the evidence to make it look like something had happened which hadn't. And I think what we will see is, whether they will be using the same kind of techniques we do to expose reality will depend on what the reality is. But I think what we can certainly expect is they will use more and more complex techniques to try and mask the reality. You know, they're going to get better at photoshopping, for example.
What about ethics? Since journalists should be very concerned with this issue, and I mean, their job is not to do counter-propaganda. They should,
Right.
I mean, make information for general public, but counter-propaganda is for, I don't know, secret services, and
But that's,
it's different,
right,
different
but that's
job.
why we said, that's why earlier I was saying we shouldn't be doing counter-propaganda. Showing the most purest version of what had happened, showing the actual forensic facts.
This was journalism in the origin.
In the origin, so that's what I'm saying, the origin of it, but just digitalized is what we are promoting. I hugely don't believe in counter-propaganda. When someone tells me, oh, the Russians have a troll factory, should we have a positive troll factory? I say no. It undermines the ethics of who we are as a society. Instead, what we should do is we should train everyone up to be strong enough in the digital space to say, hey, you know what, that thing you posted is false. Let's go back to the facts, but adopt it to a digital way, not counter-propaganda. It's not going to help.
And maybe, and this is the last comment.
You have to buy everyone a
It's
beer after this.
a cultural thing. I mean, with the education, you can raise children, kids during schools to avoid to be adults that are aware of what is going on and reading in a critical way.
That's terrific, because I remember my parents and grandparents, and you know, it's fascinating for me, but also shocking. I remember that for them it was a rule to seek the other, the second opinion. You know, it's how they were brought up in schools and so on and so on. It's a golden rule. You do not agree with that person, you know, you should know their argument very well, because, you know, otherwise there is no point of having your own argument. But now I look at, you know, people, young people as myself, and their habits of consuming media, and it's completely gone at some point. They just like to read what they like to read, and they just like to fit it in their confirmation bias. And they're annoyed and frustrated if you push them to look at the other side or try even to read or understand. This is massive gaps, you know, on the level of the whole generation. So it's not a sexy thing right now to do. It's a long-term investment, but we should teach kids to do that as a golden rule, because it has been before and worked pretty well.
And it's something that, you know, if we think back about the past, we've seen ill-intended people try to actually manipulate folks, and our resident dinosaur, Ben, can speak about that. In history, we've seen time and again where regimes were trying to influence human beings at a really early stage to brainwash them, so to speak, whether it was the Nazis or whether it was the Soviets trying to educate people in a certain way so they'd never get to that critical thinking stage, because that's our best weapon. And we're partially seeing that in Russia today happening too. Right, Ben?
Absolutely. And speaking as the dinosaur in the room,
like a very young one, though.
absolutely. Not quite extinct, but if you look at what we're seeing now with social media, yeah, we'll have a question over there. We'll come to you guys. But if you look at what we're seeing with social media now, in what way is it different from what the Nazis did in the 1930s with the feature film? In what way is that different to what the Brits did in 1918 with the newsreel? In what way is that different from what was being done in the 1890s with radio? In what way is that different to what Martin Luther was doing in the 16th century with the printing press? Every time you have had a change in communication and an innovation in communication, one of the first things that happen is people try and work out how to use it for propaganda. So what we are seeing is not new. And in fact, there's a lot to be learned from reading the histories of how did people deal with the printing presses. Well, one thing they did, for example, in the UK, they passed a law saying that, you know, freedom of speech, you can print what you want, but in any publication you have to indicate the name and the address of the publisher. And that way you have, they're still free to publish it, but if they're not even brave enough to put their name on it, then why do they have the right to speak? So there are all, I'm not saying that we should be doing that this time, but if you just think, a lot of the debates we're having now are debates that we had back in the age of the dinosaurs. So sometimes it's worth just looking back to the dinosaurs.
You look still great for 35.
Yeah, actually, I'm from Belarus, Radio Free Europe, and 150 kilometers from here is Belarus border, and we are considered there as propaganda. When before we were called like Obama's propaganda, and now we became Trump's propaganda. So it depends what perspective you have. I'm wondering, how social networks changed the media landscape in authoritarian societies, and I found out there are 4 trends in journalism in countries like Belarus. It's fact-checking journalism, investigative journalism, it's explainer journalism, and crowd reporting. But the problem is how we use these trends, what forms should we use? And we have the problem, to visualize these forms, to make them accessible and understandable by the audience. We found out that social networks, they work only with English language. For example, in iPhone, you cannot install Belarus language at all. How they want us to help fight in Russian propaganda when they do not allow us to use our own language. That's a problem. And also, there is misunderstanding not only in social networks or managers of big digital companies, because they think only about English-speaking communities, but also, for example, in governments, in states. I work for a US-funded broadcaster, but still I should admit they don't have real understanding, how these social networks change the landscape. They finance tons of money in traditional TV, which doesn't work in closed societies like Azerbaijan, Belarus, Central Asian countries. Yeah, that's my point.
I'd just like to talk about the language issue there, because that's something I've come across a lot with the work of Bellingcat and being so involved with the growth of kind of open source investigation, is that we're really trying to get into other language groups because there just isn't anything there. We're hoping soon to start doing Bellingcat Latin America so we can start reaching into the Spanish language group, because we've literally done like 1 or 2 events there, and there's been a massive interest because they haven't seen anything like this before on the scale that we're doing it.
You're so humble.
So the actual, this is a big concern of mine, because it's great if we're all speaking English and we're all learning how to do open source investigation, but what about the other countries? What's happening in the Spanish language group, Italian and German and elsewhere? If China, for example, I mean, I have no idea what's going on in China. It's like here be dragons over there, because we've no idea what's going on. So I think we need to think about what's happening in our own language group and start thinking in such a kind of Anglo-centric kind of way about this, because it affects everyone. And if we might be doing great in the English language group, but if Turkish speakers aren't being taught about how to do this, or Chinese speakers, or anyone in the world, then that's going to be a problem long term, and we just fail.
But this is also why we're doing this here, so close to policymakers, to make them understand that we are here. We're here to pressure them to set a certain dynamic up that allows for a change in their policy, and also the conversations, and Graham, you might speak to that, the conversations that we're having with the tech industry to have them realize it's more than just English, right?
So I actually wanted to say the same thing that Franak and Elliot were saying. My name is Beata, and for the past 2 years I worked with the Google News Lab here in Central and Eastern Europe. And I was providing trainings to journalists in the region. And we can talk a lot about technologies, digital, and I love it. And I'm absolutely a fan of VR and so on. But you need to think also about the people you're talking to. So, I go to newsrooms around Europe, Central and Eastern, and most of the journalists have never tried VR. So, the journalists have never tried it. So how can you imagine the ordinary people, like in small villages in Belarus or, in Romania, talking to them with that language? So what I mean is digital is super important. It's a great chance for us. It's a great threat to us as well, because like recently, for example, there was an article about, I think, Russia Today using bots and trolls for their TV coverage, like comments on a program are coming just from bots. But what I wanted to say is that we should not forget in this digital age about the offline media as well. If you think of Poland, 80% of people watch television every day. And if you turn on public television, that's where the propaganda is. So if you want to fight it, you also need to remember about the offline media and create strategies for that one as well.
And then also connect the people who
yeah,
might
exactly.
be there with
Connect
it.
the people. Remember that the people also here, but it's not only about Central and Eastern Europe. The digital knowledge is still not good. People know how to use websites, how to use social media, but that's not very in-depth. And the new tools that they're getting, they don't know them. So I just wanted to get to this point that we should also remember what people we are talking to, because we very often get so enthusiastic in the media about the technologies, but we don't think that the people don't know them. And the second thought is, yes, absolutely what Maxim was saying, the world can learn a lot from this region. So I was laughing so much when, for example, you know, the elections in the US were being screwed and you heard all the fake news and so on. Sorry for saying that, but yeah. But you could look at Romania. What was happening during the elections last year, last year, in Romania was absolutely fascinating. The amount of fake news that was popping up there was like just amazing. Like even the running candidate was accused of putting a club for young people on fire, a fire in which over 60 people died. And, you know, and people believed it. There was like anonymous videos created. So yeah, we need to look further, like just not be American or English oriented. There is a lot more to learn from different parts of the world.
Let's do one thing. Let's actually have people, if you have a question, keep it concise, but let's also take a few questions at a time just to make it a little bit more engaging. And
Thank you. Thank you, Atlantic Council, for this great meeting. Venslav from Serbia. Well, the way I try to solve the problem that Maxim mentioned, or somebody else, sorry, that even Americans will retweet pro-Russian tweets, is that since I speak Russian and Serbian and English, I'll translate the news from Russia about the way the Russia is. I mean, really is. Because there is image, let's say in Serbia, and I guess also in other countries, like in America maybe, at least for those Americans who retweet pro-Russian tweets, that Russia is maybe perfect place, paradise. So I translate the news and I call it the Russia as she is, as she really is. And I can say that those pro-Kremlin activists, they really hate me because nobody is doing that, and it's more dangerous to them, they admit that, than let's say those old-style think tanks in Serbia that just will print from time to time some report, and because I'm destroying that image of Russia as perfect place. Yeah, that's how I solve that problem. So maybe that can help you.
Okay. Very quick, one or two more, because there's the last bus going at 5 to Novotel, but you can stick around if you don't need the bus. We can talk offline afterwards.
Can I?
Yeah, there you go.
Okay, my name is Leo Ritano. I'm an investigative journalist and open source intelligence researcher from Italy. Actually, if I got the question, it was about how we can build up a network from this experience, right?
Yeah.
I believe I already participated in certain small networks which were very effective and quite simple to organize. For example, there is a secret Facebook group of open source intelligence researchers where we are journalists, open source intelligence researchers, and for example, I'm talking about what we have done because it could be an example. And I was tracking a terrorist account which was involved in London stuff. And while in 5 minutes, I was working with a Tunisian journalist, which was helping me to figure out the cultural background and the language aspects. I was doing simultaneously my graph query, other open source intelligence stuff, and a BBC journalist taking the information in order to make interviews.
Yeah.
So it was like a jam session. Really, you don't need to build up, enormous structures with panels and so forth.
Be ready to talk with
so one way to start organize a network would be make a Facebook group where people that participate to this event may get in, bring some fresh ideas, brainstorm a little, and then we can start up on several fronts and see what's coming on. I mean, without,
we'll do that. I think that's a wonderful idea. I think you're raising a really
one
good
second
point.
away.
The other thing to really talk about here, just because we need to gradually come to a close, is there a question on the other side? Yes, please. And let's keep it concise.
I'll be brief.
Thank you.
It's more of a point than a question. And I don't want to dampen the parade of any of this, but I suppose my question is, how do we pay for all of this? You know, good reporting is really expensive, and it's becoming increasingly difficult to convince editors that it's worth sending a journalist to a region which is expensive to go there, expensive to keep them safe, and allow them to do the in-depth reporting that they need to do. And there is a lot of money for journalism in this part of the world, but a lot of it comes from governments, or from kind of through embassies and things like that. And how are we able to take that money and kind of retain our independence, and you know, or bow to pressures of advertising, and you know, not just investigative reporting, but also the kind of reporting that Bellingcat does. I mean, as Eric mentioned yesterday, it took 1.5 years to do the MH17 investigation, and I'm not expecting you guys to answer this question, but it's just kind of, you know.
That is true, but I think that also partially the market decides, and I think this is what Damon talked about earlier, Maxim, about making verification sexy again. So to speak, really, right?
It already is sexy, Max.
It is, but make it even more reachable and understandable to the public. If we look at some of the instances that we saw where the Russians were hitting the wrong targets in Syria, and within just a day, Ruslan Leviv posted a tweet saying, these are not hitting ISIS targets, they're hitting these targets, compared it to photos, boom, and it's up and online. That didn't cost him really that much money. And on top of that, what it ended up with is, at the time, Secretary of Defense Ash Carter being forced to answer that question in a Pentagon press briefing in the same week that Putin went in front of the UN claiming they're attacking ISIS. So I think the more people we train in these methods, and the more we enable folks to use the type of methods and communicate without a complicated matter, I think the easier it will become to do it at a cheaper level. And on top of that, to do it in a way where it's sexy enough again for the market to be interested in it. The traffic that is being generated through these methods is amazing, and I'm sure that corporations are going to have interest in it.
And one thing I want to add to that, I mean, one question that I think about a lot is, you know, there's probably more people in this room than there is doing open source investigations in public on a regular basis, rather than it just being a small part of that job. And in my mind, that's a tremendous problem. I mean, even some of the people in this room are those people. And I found one thing that has been very useful in our work is having these kind of communities online who are doing kind of very particular types of investigations. So with the Russian airstrikes, what happened there is you have a group of about 5 people on Twitter who obsessively geolocate every kind of aerial view of a bombing. Whoever does it, and we drew on that and turned it into a data set. We didn't train them. In fact, I would say I've trained, out of the people I've trained, there's probably more people who've trained themselves to do this who are actually now doing it on a regular basis. And, you know, if there's just 100 people who are doing this on a regular basis, that's a massive problem. And if those 100 people are mainly speaking English, that's a massive problem. Yeah. So we need to figure out ways to get as many people who are doing this as possible in communities that are aligned in their own work. I don't expect journalists to go back to their newsroom and say, I'm going to work on open source investigation every day, because their editor will laugh in their face and tell them to go back to, you know, writing up press releases. So we need to figure out ways to engage as many people as possible, get them doing it. I mean, I'm working on something at the moment with a large UK newspaper to do a competition. And
do tell.
Yes, the competition is going to be a murder mystery, where we're going to basically set up fake social media accounts, have some actors go out, pretend to be on holiday, and then one of them's going to be murdered. And this is going to be seen through social media. This kind of, and we're planning it. So we'll write up a guide to do open source investigation that will be published in a major UK newspaper and local papers. It's going to be promoted on TV, and it'll introduce open source investigation to hopefully, you know, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people, just as a concept. Now, I don't expect everyone will do that, but we need to start thinking beyond just doing training events and workshops and say, how do we get as many people interested in this? Because I find time and time again, it's not training people that's the issue. It's making them aware that this is even a thing that can be done.
And I think this is sort of the perfect now, and I'm seeing several hands. I'm really sorry, I have to not pick on them. This is the perfect note to sort of end. This is about not just us here as a community, but also us towards the public and bringing them into the game. This is why we produced this event. This is why we're live streaming it. This is why we had this Digital Sherlocks hashtag. This is why we're trying to push it out from the bottom of Italy to the tip of the Nordics to really spread the word about it. This is activism. Journalism also has a role to educate the public by leading the way, and that's what we want all of you guys to do. One thing that we'll do in the close, and before I close, is that out there is 3 buckets of t-shirts, really cool t-shirts. Small, medium, and large. I'm going to need an XL, but that's a different story. And on it is the hashtag Digital Sherlocks. Some of them are saying what the fact, the others are saying many VD verified. And what we ask you to do to spread just the concept of geolocation, because that's usually the gateway drug to investigative journalism. We want you guys to leave here today, take the shirts with you, and then at some point during your way home, post a picture of yourself with it and challenge others around the world to geolocate you. Challenge the public to geolocate you. The people who will have the most compelling stories will send the winners the t-shirts, and we'll write a few stories up with our media partners in several languages, and we'll try to do a little bit of a push to show more people what one can do just with a photo. All right? So thank you everyone for being here. I want to use the final moments to thank, first of all, my team from the Digital Forensic Research Lab, but also my partners in crime, Ben Nemo and Elliot, who's the founder of Bellingcat, for just the incredible work that you guys do every single day. We have Donora and Nika, who are our fighting forces in the Baltics. They're hiding somewhere in the back. We have Nick, we have Eric, we have Rao, we have Nareem. Who else do we have here?
Sarah.
We have Sarah. She's hiding way back and posting stuff. And I'm just incredibly proud of everything you guys do every single day. And I'm also proud of what everyone else in this room is doing, because only together we'll have a chance to really fight disinformation and make open source even sexier. Thank you guys, and a huge round of applause to every single one of you.